Numbers were still glowing on my screen when my phone buzzed. 31 years of combined manufacturing experience on my team. 11 consecutive quarters of on-time delivery. And this past quarter, the one we just closed, we hit 312% of our throughput target. Not 312% efficiency, 312% of the actual unit goal. We had redesigned 2 assembly sequences on the fly when our primary polymer supplier dropped out in week 6. We cross-trained 9 operators across 3 lines so we could surge capacity without adding headcount. We had delivered every single order to Hargrove Automotive on schedule, with a defect rate of 0.3%, the lowest in the plant's 18-year history. My inbox was full of congratulations from the Hargrove account manager, from our quality director, from 3 shift supervisors who never sent emails about anything. I was leaning back in my chair with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, just letting it settle when the calendar invite hit my inbox. All hands. Main floor conference room. 8 a.m. tomorrow. Mandatory. I didn't think much of it. We'd had those before. Usually it was safety updates or HR rolling out a new timekeeping system or someone from corporate flying in to shake hands and take photos for the internal newsletter. I showed up at 7:52. Most of my team was already there. Marcus from line 2, Diane who ran our QA documentation, old Ray who'd been on the floor since before I started. We were all still riding the high a little. Someone had brought donuts. That's when the owner's son-in-law walked in. His name was Garrett Fowler. He'd married the founder's daughter, Sandra Ellison, daughter of Dale Ellison, who'd built this company from a 2-bay machine shop in 1987 into a mid-sized Tier 2 automotive supplier with 400 employees and contracts with 3 of the big 3. Dale had stepped back from day-to-day operations about 4 years earlier, handing the reins to a COO named Frank Burrell, who was competent, methodical, and trusted by the floor. Frank had been here 17 years. Garrett had been here 11 months. He walked in wearing a sport coat over a Henley, the kind of outfit that said I'm approachable but also important, and set a tablet on the table at the front of the room. He didn't make eye contact with anyone. He pulled up a slide deck. The first slide said, "Recalibrating for sustainable growth." I felt something shift in my stomach. Not panic, more like recognition. Garrett spoke for about 10 minutes. He talked about how the company was entering a new phase. He talked about how the previous quarter's results, while impressive on a surface level, had been achieved through what he called unsustainable resource allocation patterns. He used the phrase organizational recalibration 4 times. He said the company needed to move away from what he described as a reactive output culture and toward a proactive performance ecosystem. Ray, who was sitting next to me, leaned over and whispered, "What language is this?" Then Garrett got to the bonuses. He said that after reviewing the compensation structure with his advisory team, he had determined that the Q3 performance bonuses, which had been contractually established as part of our department's incentive package 3 years prior, would not be distributed this cycle. He said the company needed to redirect those resources toward infrastructure investment and strategic capability building. He said he was confident the team would understand that short-term sacrifice created long-term value. The room went completely silent. Not the polite silence of people absorbing information. The specific, pressurized silence of people deciding whether what they just heard was actually what they heard. Marcus raised his hand. "Those bonuses are in our contracts." Garrett nodded like this was a reasonable but naive observation. The language around the bonus structure does have some flexibility built in, particularly around the word discretionary in the performance clause. We've had our legal team review it. "Discretionary based on company performance," Diane said. "The company hit record numbers." "Based on overall strategic performance," Garrett said, "which includes capital positioning. We're making infrastructure investments that will benefit everyone long term." He smiled when he said it. Not a mean smile. Worse, a smile that genuinely believed it was being generous. I didn't say anything. I sat there with my cold coffee and my 312%, and I looked at Garrett Fowler, who had been in this building for 11 months and had never once set foot on the production floor before 10 a.m. And I thought about something very carefully. I thought about the meeting I'd had with Frank Burrell 3 years ago, in February, when we were renegotiating my contract. Frank had wanted to restructure my compensation, lower base, higher performance incentive, because he believed in what my team was capable of. I had agreed, but I had asked for one specific addition to my contract, a clause that Frank, to his credit, had reviewed with the company's outside counsel and agreed to without much argument because, at the time, it seemed like the kind of thing that would never actually matter. After the all-hands ended, people filed out slowly. Some of them were on their phones already, texting spouses, texting union reps, doing the math on what they'd been counting on. Ray stopped next to me at the door and said, "You going to let this stand?" I told him I needed to look at some paperwork first. I went to my office, closed the door, and pulled up my employment contract. Section 7, subsection C, paragraph 4. I had read it maybe a dozen times over the years, not because I expected to use it, but because when you've been doing this long enough, you learn to know exactly what's in writing and exactly what it means. The clause read as follows, condensed. In any quarter where the department under my supervision achieved a throughput performance rating exceeding 200% of the established baseline target, and where said performance was achieved without exceeding the approved labor budget by more than 15%, I was entitled to a performance multiplier of 275% of my standard quarterly bonus, regardless of any company-wide bonus suspension, deferral, or discretionary override, which were explicitly carved out as non-applicable conditions. Frank had included that carve-out language specifically because he'd wanted the incentive to be real. He'd wanted me to know that if I delivered, I would be paid. Period. My team had hit 312%. We had come in at 11.4% over labor budget inside the 15% threshold by a margin of 3.6 points. The clause was active. I sat back in my chair and did the arithmetic twice, then a third time. I pulled up the plant's baseline targets from 3 years ago, cross-referenced against this quarter's production logs, and confirmed every number. Then I went down the hall to Frank Burrell's office. Frank was at his desk, and the look on his face when I knocked told me he already knew the all-hands had not gone well. He waved me in. "Close the door," he said. I sat down and slid a single sheet of paper across his desk. It was a printout of Section 7C4, with the relevant numbers annotated in the margins in my handwriting. Frank read it. He read it again. He set it down and looked at me over the top of it. "I know," I said. He was quiet for a long moment. "This is going to be a problem for Garrett." "That's not really my concern," I said. "My concern is that this clause is valid, the conditions have been met, and I'm formally notifying you in writing of my intent to collect." Frank nodded slowly. "You know he's going to push back." "He can push back as much as he wants to," I said. "But the carve-out language is explicit. A company-wide bonus suspension is specifically listed as a non-applicable condition. His legal team can read the same paragraph." Frank picked up the printout again. He held it for a moment. Then he said, "I'll need to loop in Dale." That was the part I had been counting on. Dale Ellison had not been in the building much lately. He was 71 years old and spent most of his time between his place in Naples and a fishing cabin in Montana. He had handed off operations in good faith to Frank, and Frank had run things well. Garrett's elevation into a strategic oversight role had happened gradually, through the machinery of family dynamics, and Dale had likely not been reading every memo. I said, "That seems appropriate. This is a contractual matter, not a management discretion matter." I handed Frank a formal written notice, dated that day, documenting my intent to collect under Section 7C4. Then I stood up, thanked him for his time, and went back to the production floor. For the next 3 days, nothing happened on the surface. Garrett sent a follow-up email to the all-hands group reiterating his points about strategic investment and expressing confidence in the team's resilience. 3 people on my team submitted updated resumes to internal job postings that same afternoon. Marcus came to me privately and asked if he had any options. I told him to give me a little more time. On the 4th day, I got a meeting request from Garrett. Conference room. 2 o'clock. When I walked in, Garrett was already there with a woman I didn't recognize. Turned out to be his personal attorney, not company counsel. She had a legal pad and a very practiced neutral expression. Garrett told me that he had reviewed my notification with his team and believed there were grounds to contest the clause on the basis of what he called changed organizational circumstances. He said the clause had been written under a previous strategic framework and that the company's current direction represented a material change in operating conditions. I let him finish. Then I asked his attorney one question. "Can you point me to the language in Section 7C4 that includes a material change provision?" She looked down at her legal pad. She didn't answer immediately. "Because I've read it approximately 40 times in the past 4 days, I said, "and I don't see one. What I do see is a list of specifically excluded override conditions, which includes, and I'm quoting directly, any company-wide compensation suspension, deferral, or modification implemented after the performance period has commenced. I put my own copy on the table. The bonus suspension was announced on the last day of the quarter. The performance period had commenced 11 weeks earlier. The attorney made a note. Garrett looked at her. She gave him a small, careful shake of her head. "I think," Garrett said after a pause, "that we can find a resolution here that works for everyone." "I think so too," I said. "The resolution is paying what the contract specifies." 2 days later, Frank called me into his office again. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. "Dale wants to get on a call," he said. "Of course," I said. The call was that afternoon. Dale Ellison joined from what looked like a dock somewhere. Sunlight on water behind him. A coffee mug on the railing. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him in person, but his eyes were sharp. He asked me to walk him through the situation. I did. I covered my contract, the performance numbers, the clause, the carve-out, and the timeline. I didn't embellish anything. I didn't editorialize about Garrett. I just laid out the facts in sequence the same way I'd lay out a production issue for a client. When I finished, Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Frank, is the performance documentation clean?" Frank said it was. Dale said, "And the clause is valid." Frank said it was. Dale said it was. Dale looked off to one side for a moment toward the water. Then he said, "Son, go ahead and handle this." I understood he was talking to Frank, not to me. Then he looked directly into the camera. "I'm sorry this got to this point. That's not how we do things here." He ended the call. I found out from Frank the next morning what happened after. Dale had called Garrett directly. I don't know exactly what was said. Frank didn't tell me and I didn't ask. But within 48 hours, Garrett's title had changed from Chief Strategy Officer to something called Senior Advisor for External Partnerships, which, as best I could tell, involved no direct reports and no operational authority. He kept his office for about 3 more weeks, and then one day the nameplate was gone. The bonuses were released to my department the following Friday, not just mine. The full team bonus pool that had been suspended, which Frank had apparently argued for separately during the same conversations. Every person on my line from Marcus down to the 3 operators we'd cross-trained in week 6 received what they had earned. Ray stopped me on the floor after the pay stubs went out. He had a look on his face that was somewhere between relieved and quietly furious. The particular expression of someone who has been around long enough to know that this outcome was the exception, not the rule. "How long did you know about that clause?" he asked. 3 years, I said. He shook his head. "You just waited." "I didn't wait," I said. "I did the work and I kept the paperwork. There's a difference." A week after that, Frank called me in one more time. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was an updated org chart and a new title, Director of Manufacturing Operations, with a compensation package to match. The role that, functionally, I had already been doing. I looked at it for a moment. Then I slid it back. "I appreciate it, Frank," I said, "but I don't need a title to do what I do. What I need is for my team to know their work means something, and their contracts mean what they say." Frank looked at me for a long moment. I think he understood. I thanked him and walked back out to the floor. Marcus was running line 2 through a new cycle sequence he'd developed himself, something he'd been working on for weeks that would cut our changeover time by about 4 minutes per run. Diane was updating the QA log with numbers that were going to make the Hargrove account manager very happy. Ray was at his station doing exactly what he'd been doing for 23 years, with the same precision and the same quiet competence he brought every single morning, regardless of whether anyone in a sport coat was paying attention. I stood there for a minute and watched all of it. Titles are easy to hand out and easy to take away. Performance is documented. Contracts are written down. And when you build something real, when you actually build it in the physical world with real people and real machines and real deadlines, the paper eventually catches up to the truth. It always does. You just have to be patient enough to still be standing there when it happens.